Good morning, Dr. Tolliver. Thank you for allowing me to do this video since I won't be there this afternoon. I decided to use the article by Sunju Lee, and the article is Knucklebones and Knocking Bones, Accidental Trickster, and Ellison's Invisible Man. Before beginning this, I went over, what kind of article it is, like what we talked about last week. And it's peer reviewed 2006, so it's still fairly decently recent. And it states in the article that she's a graduate student of University of Nevada when she wrote this. But since that time, she has gotten her PhD from Harvard and is now a professor at University of Nevada. So she credibility, that credentials behind her that she needs, as well as she's written 2 books since that time talking about the slave narrative. So this is her kind of field of expertise. Her article is discussing Ellison's, if you look at it, Change the Joke and Slip the Yoke, which was written in 1958. Ellison to essentially criticize Stanley Hyman's article, which I don't know the title because in both articles it didn't state it. I couldn't find the article. And this one, even the Ellison one, I had to kind of obtain illegally. I had to take screenshots to get it. But Ellison is criticizing Hyman because Hyman makes the argument that the minstrel figure descends from the African folklore that has the archetype, the trickster. And Ellison completely disagrees with this. He states that number one, that the minstrel does not comes from what whites deem as what blackness is. So the white man created this minstrel figure. So to state that it comes from African folklore would be false. He also states that it couldn't come from the trickster figure because the trickster figure isn't just folklore. He says that most cultures have this, as well as it's an American thing. And that's one of the big things that Ellison had an issue with, is that Hyman really wanted to state this is American, and Ellison is stating no, sometimes they're interchangeable. And when Hyman cites the Invisible Man to Ellison, no, that's not right. Like a lot of what I've both what is African, what is American, and so this is essentially in this article. So Lee agrees mostly with what Ellison is stating, and Ellison states that the narrator doesn't play the minstrel figure. But what Lee argues, and this is on page, give me a second. On page 466, she argues that the Invisible Man is an unstable hybrid of trickster and minstrel. So it's not really so much that minstrel comes from the trickster. It's more of no man is both a hybrid, or a hybrid of both. So she agrees with that. Yes, one doesn't come from the other, but she argues that it's the hybrid of both. So that's the narrator. And this is how she kind of argues for that. These are her warrants. She uses Frederick Douglass evidence. Frederick Douglass, who he did precede Ellison, but that he was one of the ones who really wrote about being disturbed by the minstrel shows. And so he believed that black men should perform authentically. And this is what Lee argues on page 463. So this is towards the beginning of her article. And she kind of asked the question, she says, how is a colored man to do so in a world defined by whites? And so the question becomes, okay, the black man wants to perform authentically, how can he do that when it's a world of white men? Because essentially, if the black man is playing as the minstrel, he is playing what the white man has created. And she further states that Webster states that blackface is what it means to be black. That's the definition that's found in Webster. And so when a performer is performing as a minstrel, he puts on blackface to do this, which is the essence of blackness according to Webster. So she states this as an argument to state that the world as well as the words that people use are defined by white men. And so how can performers, especially at that time, how can they perform genuinely if this is how these things are defined, if they're defined by white terms, because technically they are performing authentically. And then so she continues to say, basically black discourse, so black language lexicon, linguistic representations lie on top of white discourse. So anytime that any type of wording that's used, the black man kind of adheres to what the white definition of that is. And so it's hard from that white world to be, this is what black is, because basically blackness is defined. What is blackness? That's how we get the minstrel character. And she even states how Douglas really struggles with this, with language. He has to redefine a lot of words, because even one of the examples she uses is abolition on page 464 is that the definition didn't help, and that men want to talk, why would they want to define that? And so he had to redefine that. And so she states that Douglas really struggles with this. And so essentially what happens is that when Douglas writes, he becomes a ghostwriter. Essentially, he shadows his master in how to write. So he uses the language, he uses the way that it's written, but he's also writing in the other, which is blackness. And so she makes this whole case that our narrator in The Invisible Man is a ghostwriter. He shifts between this black and white ghost language that's hybrid. He falls under what is black, under the white wording, under what is white, but then presenting the other, a ghostwriter. So this is kind of her evidence for her hybrid of trickster and minstrel. And once she makes this claim on 466, after that she's really just basically talking about how in the book most of the characters wear a mask, and the narrator essentially, like even when he's giving his speech at the Battle Royal, he is playing the white man's role by, performing in the fight, by giving the speech, but while he's doing that, he's swallowing blood. And as he swallows blood, he's swallowing authentically. That's when he ends up making the mistake of saying social responsibility, right? Social responsibility is what the white man says. Social equality is what is the blackness. So she just makes several examples like this from the book to kind of further this idea that he's a ghostwriter. But essentially her argument hinges on this idea of him being this hybrid because he's a ghostwriter. And so in my analysis of the argument, using the chart from page 52, what I found is that really it's not a bad argument. And when I say bad, I know that's it. Essentially, it is parts of it are valid, parts of it are factual, but really the problem is the actual warranting itself is not. So the logic makes sense. You have this very much claims equals conclusion. That's the validity, that's there, but it's the factuality sometimes it's not there. So it's not quite a sound argument. And so what I mean by that is on page 466, she talks about, when she goes into the whole ghost language, she explains it as basically like this chart. That if we have an axis, right? X is the standard English, Y is a black vernacular. She then states that basically what belongs on X is minstrel. So characters go with the standard English. They're defined by what the standard English says, what the white man says. Is the trickster character. And this is the part where I was like, I don't know exactly how you're getting those to add up. Her part of Ellison's argument was that the trickster figure wasn't just a black figure, isn't just a archetype from African folklore, it's from other folklores, is that she was able to equal black vernacular with trickster. And just from the language to all of a sudden now it represents these archetypes or these type of characters that we see over and over again in literature. I don't know how she decided those equaled one another. She doesn't give much reasoning as to why one goes with the other. Give me a second. On page 465, this is when she's talking about most of it. Really, as I'm looking at the evidence, she says, medical model of signification, the standard English and black vernacular X and Y. Such a model more accurately describes a perpendicular rather than between the two. To this model, I would propose a third axis, and this is the Z that I haven't talked about yet that I have on here. Of ghost language, the Z-axis splits the space between and adds a third dimension to the previously two-dimensional graph. In other words, ghost language in that liminal space between X and Y. Okay, that I get. So all this totally makes sense to me, but this is the part that I don't understand. In other words, if we map the minstrel and trickster figures onto this graph, the former would, so minstrel would be along here, and or the axis of hegemonic white articulation, and the latter would lie along the y-axis, or the axis of black vernacular. And that's the part that the X, to me, that makes sense. The Y, not so much. I don't know why she was able to get that the trickster obviously goes with Y. If anything, I feel like this model add up to that. And then she states, the invisible man then is neither minstrel nor trickster. He is an unstable hybrid of both. And that's the Z axis, I guess, if you would call it that. And so that part of the argument I had a hard time seeing the relation, because that's all the evidence she gave for this type, for equating the X with minstrel, the Y with trickster. She didn't really set that up prior to that little section. So I think it's in that sense. Because I can't see this very well. How can you get Z if the Y and X isn't acting the way that it is, as she says it is? Now, the conclusion, it talks about how conclusions sometimes aren't explicitly, I think that's there. I do understand the trickster and minstrel and evidence throughout the rest of the text to prove that. So I think if we're going with the logic of, and she gives that conclusion, to me that makes sense. That part of the argument is strong. The problem is that the warranting, there's that cross between going from this minstrel doesn't make sense. The hybrid language, the white world that sets up the signifier and the definitions and the significations, that all made logical sense, and that's all found on page 466. It's only when we get to this graph on page, oh, I'm sorry, the other one's on 465. It's only when we get to the graph on 466 that I don't see quite how the outcome comes to that. Last thing that I was looking at is how on the chart on 52, its warranting leads to an illogical conclusion. I think that's she has that in her article, is that her warrants do lead to a logical conclusion, as I was saying earlier. She linked acting and being authentic, and I do think that there is a role for that, especially the way that she describes it. Gates echoes, so she's another critic, Gates. Black people signify in a society in which they were intentionally introduced as the subjugated, as the enslaved cipher. Being minstrel, forms a black subject onto an enslaved words as a negative sign. Okay, that to me makes sense. Theatrical and linguisticness are thus linked in their enslavement to white modes of death. Indeed, attaching white means to blackness becomes a lexicon of blackface, a Webster's dictionary of what it means to be or act black. Yet in cataloging and performing Negro, minstrelsy, I think that's how you say it, relies on white vocabulary and becomes not a performative dictionary of American Negro usage, but an entry in what could be called the dictionary of white American usage. That to me makes the connecting the warrants to the conclusion. That part of the warrants is. So the whole idea of going back to my chart, right? The whole idea of minstrel with standard English, yes. But after that, she never describes why this would necessarily be the trickster figure. She only concentrates on this. And I think the audience has already been won over by this idea. It's more of this, especially after reading Ellison's article, that it doesn't make sense. So essentially, what she figure works with the problem that there is the whole idea of how the trickster figure works. And then so for her to make this conclusion that the invisible man is neither minstrel nor trickster, he's a hybrid of both, she proves the minstrel part, she doesn't really prove, and that's the part where it's like, well then, and then now what Ellison said about his own character, which is fine, except that it's not an argument in that sense. So looking at this article, I wouldn't use this part. There are some things in here that I think are really valuable, especially the part that I just read about the linguistics that go with it. I can definitely use that as a teacher because I definitely go over what it means for these characters in literature. And I use parts of it. I do it with Huck Finn, God. So all of I can use in the classroom, but for my paper as a whole, there's not much that I would use. Because I think I still want to go with this whole idea of Claire wearing a mask, Bledsoe wearing a mask, and in this article specifically, it talks about Bledsoe wearing a mask, but it doesn't really any illuminating information. It's pretty much stuff that I'd already thought about Bledsoe and when he wears the mask for the white man, and then when he's not around the white man, he becomes his authentic self. So I think I could use those parts in my paper to just kind of prove that idea first, establishing that premise before I move on to like my major claims and conclusions, but isn't very helpful for what in my paper, especially since her whole argument hinges on this idea of what the trickster is and what minstrel is, and she doesn't quite capture both of those things. I think that's everything. If there's anything else that you would like me to cover or explain or clarify, or if I didn't do something, please let me know. But I think according to your first email, this is essentially what you wanted from us.